Thank you very much for that warm American welcome. Yes, I do call New York home these days. For a small town in America, it's got a bit going for it. Don't need to take your kids to the amusement park for fun rides. You just take a cab across New York streets, and just up and down and up and down. They think that's entertainment enough. It's a great city, however. I've been here now for a couple of years. As you mentioned, by implication, in our last national elections in 2013, I happened to come second, which is a polite way of saying I lost. So one of the things you discover is that as a recently defeated Prime Minister of a country, you're not readily employable in the national employment market when the other team wins. So I decided to seek political refugee status here in the United States. They took me at Harvard for a year, did a whole lot of work on US-China relations, and now the Asia Society up on Park Avenue is where I work. I'm president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. We're a think tank, do tank, focusing on foreign policy and security questions, economic, trade, investment questions, critically, also on sustainability questions affecting the broad continent of Asia. In fact, we're working now on a big proposal on how to develop a Northeast Asian carbon market, bringing together China, Japan, and Korea. The South, not the North. You mentioned the US elections. It's a pretty interesting spectacle. It's kind of one part World Championship Wrestling, a bit of National Football League thrown in. I mean, I thought we were pretty rough and robust in our politics in Australia, but compared with this stuff, I mean, the Australian Parliament is like a Sunday school picnic. So good luck in terms of what happens next Tuesday. I, of course, remain politically neutral, and of course, I will not express an opinion about who should win, whoever she may be. Basically, I'm a China guy. I started my professional career working on China, language, history, culture, and I've spent most of the last 35 or 40 years doing that. In one capacity or another, a scholar, a diplomat in business, foreign minister, prime minister. And it's a country I've got to know reasonably well, but it's full of surprises. It's jam-packed, full of surprises. But what I discover is 40 years on, since I first went to the Australian National University to study that language, is that China has moved from the margins to the absolute centre of everything, every major policy question in the world, not least of which is climate change. It's a product of scale, and it's a product of the pace of change. And therefore, if we're concerned about the future of global sustainability, we're concerned about the future of climate change, frankly, China has to be the place where you begin. Together, the United States representing some 40% of total global emissions. And so this is the big one. If the Chinese are serious about it, and following that the Indians too, and Uncle Sam plays its part, then we can fix this thing. If you don't, and if they don't, we won't. That's kind of the guts of it. And I'll go to the core of that in my remarks this evening. Let's look for a bit at the policy framework. You mentioned before that I'd attended the Copenhagen conference in 2009 as Australian head of delegation. It was one of the weirdest conferences I've ever attended. Any of you survived Copenhagen in the room? Okay, no. They're still in therapy, all those people. And I still bear the stigmata from the occasion. 2 days locked in a room with 20 heads of state, including President Obama, Chancellor Merkel, and a whole bunch of others, trying to forge an agreement. Didn't work so well. We produced something called a Copenhagen Accord, which, if you look at the detail, actually has some pretty key parts to it. One, for the first time, we agreed on a global temperature target. That is, we would not allow temperature increases to go beyond 2 degrees centigrade by century's end. We hadn't agreed that before. Second, we agreed that it was both a developing country and a developed country responsibility. We hadn't agreed that before either. It was purely the developeds. Thirdly, we agreed that we should develop a system of global measurement, reporting and verification, MRV, and we also decided to establish a climate change adjustment fund for the most exposed countries. But at the end, we could not translate that into an agreed treaty. There's a core reason for that. The US wasn't sufficiently enthusiastic, and China wasn't enthusiastic at all back then. I know, I was in the room and saw it all happen. And after 2 days, we were all left with some level of despair. Roll the clock along, however, 5 years or more to Paris. This time I was there representing our Asia Policy Institute. And the political environment had totally changed because two factors had changed. President Obama was in radical leadership mode on climate change action, and President Xi Jinping had got religion on climate change. And this was a good thing. People ask, how did that happen in a relatively short period of time? I suppose if you looked at the work in which the Chinese had done domestically, first of all, their air pollution crisis, not just in Beijing, but in so many other cities in the country, caused policy leaders to sit up and pay attention. That they couldn't continue in this direction anymore without actually engendering a massive political reaction from people who said, I am not prepared to suck this stuff in every day for the rest of my rapidly shortening lives. They got the message. And the connection between carbon, air pollution, and carbon climate change was relatively clear-cut. Secondly, the Chinese worked out that by not attending to climate change, given the size of their global footprint, if they didn't act, they're going to cruel entirely their national economic and political future. Because if you were to do the map on the impacts of climate change, producing temperature increases by century's end of 3 and 4 degrees centigrade, the impact within China in terms of its water supply, in terms of the arability of its land in the northern part of the country would be huge. And for those reasons, China said it's in our national interest to act. And thirdly, and this is an important factor when we look at the future, China worked out that this was very bad global public relations, to be dragging the chain on global climate change action, particularly once you'd become the world's largest polluter. Of course, there are still real problems with what's been agreed at Paris. We had our hallelujah moment, we celebrated, and it's important to celebrate policy successes, because in this domain, they haven't been coming fast, frequent, or fruitful. But let's focus on 3 core things which come out of Paris as we all head to Marrakesh for the next conference of the parties very soon. Number 1 is this. If you put together all the national commitments put together at Paris and since Paris, they add up to still a climate change impact or a temperature impact by century's end of about 3 degrees centigrade increase. That is 1 to 1.5 degrees in excess of where we need to be. Number 2, that assumes that all those guys and girls gathered together in Paris who stuck their hands up in support of this treaty document, which will soon enter into force, will actually, in practice, honour those independent national commitments on the ground. That of itself involves some leap of faith if you're as familiar with the political process as I am. And number 3, how do we actually know at the end of the day when there is still no agreement on a global system of effective, comprehensive measurement, reporting and verification? That is, how do we know that people are doing what they're saying? Or as we'd say in Australia, in an elegant fashion, how do you keep the bastards honest? That's a reference to the political opposition in our country at any time. And these are core questions of global politics as they are of national politics. So they actually constitute, frankly, the framework for what now must be done. Celebrate the success, But let us also be realistic about the challenges which lie ahead. So what is to be done? Number one, simple. Maintain political pressure. I've been in this business. I've seen it when political campaigns are orchestrated against governments which seek to act. In Australia, I introduced legislation which remains for a mandatory renewable energy target of 20% of total energy supply by 2020. We started with 4% of energy supply, we're now at 16%. Laws make a difference. Number two, we legislated for a carbon price. The Conservatives in Australia, who defeated me at the last election, have subsequently repealed that legislation. Three, I signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Four, we subsidised low-income folks to put solar panels on their roofs, covering 20% of the total national housing stock. And five, became active in the global climate debate, not just in Copenhagen, but in the subsequent work of the Global Sustainability Panel of the United Nations, whose report, Resilient People, Resilient Planet, I am a co-author of. But maintaining political pressure at home and around the world is critical. This deal ain't done yet. The gap between 3 degrees and the 1.5 where we need to be is huge. So celebrate, yes, but maintain your rage even more. It is fundamental. And not just with relation to your own government, though it's the world's second largest emitter, but in relation to the pressure which is applied to all governments around the world. And that goes to not just national arrangements, but wider arrangements as well, such as regional carbon markets, such as the work we are now seeking to do at the Asia Policy Institute on bringing these 3 quite different economic and political systems together against the possibility that they may agree on a regional carbon market, which seems fanciful now, but frankly 5 years ago the idea of China and the US now cooperating on global climate change as the only domain in which they effectively agree on anything at present, well frankly I think this is within the range of possibility and certainly within the range of being bold. Maintain political pressure. Secondly, and I'd commend you guys for this here at BSR and the companies from which we have heard already and will hear over the days of this conference, and that is the corporate effort is critical. Politicians worry about people and they worry about corporations because corporations employ people. When you reach a critical mass of corporations saying to governments and leading through their own corporate action, climate change is real and we must act, and frankly that carries not just political pressure in itself, but it carries the enormous pressure of having led by example. And that's therefore where the work of corporates in this country and around the world and the work they did in Paris is critical, for which you should be encouraged, for which you should be congratulated, and for which you should continue to be challenged for the future as well. It works. I've seen it work. When corporates finally obtain a critical mass within a country on the need to act on sustainability most broadly, climate change in particular, and suddenly you'll see the wheels of government turning in different directions, and the speed within which those wheels then turn is adjusted accordingly. What can then be done? Political pressure, corporate example, and corporate pressure. But thirdly, and this is where I'd like to conclude my spoken remarks to you before, well, my formal remarks to you before I continue to speak from down here and take a few questions. The third thing is about finance. Without finance, effective action on climate change is a dead letter. Let's just be blunt about this. We can all have warm feelings in our hearts, evangelical or otherwise. Unless money is brought to the table to make change happen in the significant decisions which governments and others make on the nature of energy supply, on the nature of energy use, and frankly, we are simply building castles in the air. We erect a global Potemkin village of climate change aspirations, but we don't actually deliver the finance necessary to make a real difference on the ground. So how then is this to be done? Well, people say that's for the United Nations. Well, that's terrific. Last time I looked at the UN's total budget for all forms of assistance around the world, it runs at about 142 billion a year, and that's before you run out of money trying to deal with the Syrian humanitarian crisis. There is no effective UN fund for this, with the exception of the Green Climate Fund, which was agreed at the Paris conference itself. Secondly, people say, well, that's what the World Bank is for and the major development banks around the world. Well, there's 6 of them, and if you do the maths there, it becomes pretty interesting. The World Bank has calculated that the world needs each year, developing countries need each year between $1.6 and $2.5 trillion for the normal growth in and maintenance of infrastructure. It needs, in addition to that, $200 to $300 billion each year to make that infrastructure climate resilient before you go on to constructing new infrastructure at any order of magnitude. So that's on the demand side, according to the World Bank. On the supply side, what are we doing? Each year, we're currently providing $28 billion for the financing of climate-friendly infrastructure. And if you really stretch the balance sheet of all 6 public development banks around the world, really stretched it, maybe you could get to a point where you're investing $500 billion a year on infrastructure projects which were climate neutral but still generating the economic development machinery necessary for a country, including its energy infrastructure. That $500 billion represents about 1/4 or 1/6 of any calculation of global need to turn what we have aspired to do in Paris into a reality. Now, I may be the son of a dairy farmer, which I am. I enjoyed the early photographs of the dairy cattle. I've said howdy to cows looking just like that in Australia. The only problem is when they start answering back, you know it's time to leave the dairy farm. But the bottom line is this, based on my primary school mathematics in a rural primary school in Australia, is that providing through the public development banks, if you can get them to do that, 1/6 of the finance necessary to deliver the climate neutral energy and related infrastructure across the developing world is not sufficient to make the difference. So where then do you go? The answer, my friends, lies unequivocally, because there's nowhere else to turn, to private finance. The core policy question for us all, for those of us serious about sustainable development in general and climate change in particular, is where do we obtain sufficient private finance in order to make this transformation necessary? And how do we do it in a manner which doesn't assume that private finance is simply going to take an utterly philanthropic approach to doing business? Because if they would do that, they would soon be out of business. So within that, again, the challenge is this: how, given the trillions of dollars at present of underutilised private capital rusting away in banks on negligible interest rates, how can that be delivered to the critical infrastructure projects across the world which will make a fundamental difference to climate change neutrality into the future, and in a manner which still yields a rate of return which the owners of that capital can live with? Therefore, where that takes us is, how does the UN, the World Bank, the major development banks, and global private capital work together to do either of the 3 following things? 1, begin to unlock domestic private finance within developing countries, which is currently underutilised in this domain, where various forms of national or maybe international sovereign guarantees are necessary for projects at large scale, or risk sharing in order to make sure that those projects occur. These may be at a very small scale. It may be a very small power plant in southern Zimbabwe, but one which might require the equivalent of $100,000 worth of investment. But unless it can be made, and with the risk factor taken into account by the local developer of the energy infrastructure in question, it won't happen. Secondly, the same principle applies to the global financing of very large infrastructure projects and large energy projects in emerging countries. How do we intelligently use the International Finance Corporation, the agency, MEGA, for assessing risk and guaranteeing insurance for large-scale development projects in a way which delivers the project but reduces the risk to capital for the private investor. We're doing that at a very small scale at present. It can be done at a much larger scale. The example being, of course, if you, in the bankability of a project, go to your private financiers and say, we'd like to develop this very large energy project in Vietnam, but we think that given all the country risk factors, we can only see ourselves clear for a 12% rate of return, when in fact, given country risk, we need to be at 22. Who plugs the difference? Again, applying pretty simple primary school mathematics from the Commonwealth of Australia, what I would say is, plug in the 10% if you are a source of public capital is infinitely cheaper than trying to plug the 100% and trying to build the whole thing yourself. Therefore, that lies as a core piece of logic for the future as well. If the UN, the major development banks, and the member states are serious about delivering the finance necessary to turn the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate change goals in particular into reality. Which brings us to the third thing that could and should be done, which is what major banks cry out for is a series of bankable projects for which the pre-work is done so that they can then consider it on the basis of its own bank financials in terms of the feasibility of the project. I, for my sins, and it's a great opportunity, sit on the advisory board of Morgan Stanley on sustainability. And there, the rubber hits the road on looking at how projects of this nature can be financed. And one of the great questions which are raised constantly is, where is the list of globally bankable projects where these funds can be delivered? So I conclude on this. Getting finance right in this mix of national and international, public and private finance is frankly the core policy question lying before us, in which we all have a role in mobilising people to action. Your call here today is to be bold, so let's be bold in the political pressure we bring to bear on national governments. Let's be bold in the pressure we bring together on the future leadership of the United Nations, the World Bank and the major development banks. Let's be bold also in the pressure we bring to bear on the major private financial institutions of the world as well. Because with just a bit of imagination and a bit of creativity, we can turn this into a project and an opportunity which turns the climate change aspirations we agreed to in Paris 12 months ago into a reality for the 21st century, which our kids will inherit. I thank you for your time.
Kevin, that's fantastic. Thank you. You can borrow my U.S. passport if you want to run for office here next week. And I'm going to...
I was going to go for dog catcher somewhere. So.
There's other offices you might want to consider. I'm going to ask a couple questions, take questions from the audience. Also, let's use Twitter, the hashtag BSR16. We should see a couple of questions pop up, so feel free to offer questions that way. So I think it was a great call to action there towards the end of your talk. We all know, of course, that political leaders have a long and complicated agenda. Isn't there some risk that people say, well, Paris is over, I'm now going to turn to the other 37 things I've got to deal with on an urgent basis? And if so, how do we maintain the pressure so that this remains high on the public agenda?
That's certainly been a core question during my own time in political office. It's always a challenge and a tension between the immediate and the urgent, or the immediate and the important. You're always going to have some guy from your media office walk in and say, but Prime Minister, haven't you seen the fact that J.B. Slobodnik III has just attacked you because of your failure to deliver 2 hospitals in 3 towns? Now, it's all about, frankly, priorities. Secondly, the real challenge is this. The ease with which the anti-climate change action lobby has had it in previous decades has been based on the fact that the impact of climate change was seen in the never-never. It's an Australian term for never-ever. That it's way out there, and frankly, maybe it's not real. If so, why should I pay the cost? And the further generations in the future can fix it, and besides, technology will be there. That's kind of the argument. You've heard it a million times. I tell you what's now different, and I use the Peking story, is that when Xi Jinping in 2014, through what was unfolding with pollution levels in Beijing that day, which were registering at about 400 to 500 on the normal scale, 67 being the acceptable World Health Organization standard, that suddenly the abstract had become particular, and that the important had in fact become immediate. And when we this year, in 2016, for the 10th year running, proclaimed this year as the hottest year on record in terms of global average temperatures, how much more here and now warning do you need? Farmers, I grew up on a farm, now by and large say, yep, it's all happening, it's just not like it used to be, unseasonable weather events, temperature increases, etc. And major traumatic events. So I think, to answer your question, there is enough material now, right now, to turn the climate change agenda into a daily challenge because of what is happening for real out there right now. You don't have to be a futurologist to sit there with a lens looking 30 years hence. So I think that's the challenge. It's a challenge of political leadership, is to bring that before the attention of the voting public. And that actually begins to change political behaviour and affect priorities.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about another part of the Asia-Pacific region. Let's go outside Australia, outside of China. To what degree does the debate remain stuck in a development versus climate headlock, or has that been broken a little bit? And of course, you mentioned India. India has really been the loudest, largest voice on that subject. How do you see that right now?
I think it's trending in the right direction. At Copenhagen, what I saw was India and China in lockstep on the conference floor. Now that's not the case. At Paris, it was China and the US acting together on the other side of the equation of let's get an agreement, and as ambitious as we can get, and India saying, oh dear, we better not be left isolated. So into the future, if I look at what the relevant ministries are saying in Delhi, and in my capacity in the Asia Policy Institute and with colleagues, I've been there a lot and spoken with Prime Minister Modi and the relevant ministers. They are moving at a policy level in the right direction. It's slow, I grant you, but it's no longer the adamant levels of resistance that we've had in the past. You're right to point about this development versus climate change or sustainable environmental argument being seen at loggerheads. That's why what we did with the Sustainable Development Goals was ultimately so important. Leave aside the 17 goals and all of the targets which flow underneath them, and that's good work by the international community. But finally, we've agreed on a set of global goals which say enough is enough in terms of this historical logjam between economic development, environmental sustainability, and frankly human rights being the third pillar. This is one integrated development challenge, opportunity, and reality. And so China's leadership in bringing the G77, the developing countries with them, in the Paris Agreement, secondly, but then in the previous September, the Sustainable Development Goal Agreement here at the UN in New York, actually concluded that debate at a formal global level. The national ramifications continue. You know, India you've just mentioned, but I see the trend going in the right direction.
Well, and just like you said about China, where the question became not why would we act, but why wouldn't we act because of public pressure, that script seems to have been flipped a bit for others as well. We've got a question from Twitter, and then I'm going to look out to the audience. So you talked about the fact that public-private finance is the question for the century, so let's dig into that a little bit. Question is, how can the public sector facilitate private investment?
I think through two things. One is expanding rapidly, for example, the operation of MEGA.
Not everyone may know what MEGA is.
It's basically the institution within the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank Group in Washington, which calculates effectively the insurance risk against a particular development project going wrong, and therefore seeks to make it possible for the private financing of that development to proceed by itself using the public funds of the bank to insure against the risk. And so that, for me, is the conceptual model which we've been trialling, if you like, at a MEGA level within the World Bank for the last decade or so. So how do you do that at scale in order to make it work for global private finance? I think the second argument is this. If those of you who are looking at the returns on your bank accounts recently and looking at your returns...
Bank accounts have returns? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. So 2% you're doing well, 1% is normal. Go to Japan, it's minus 0.5. So you pay the bank for the privilege of holding your money. So if that is not just the current reality, but one which has been unfolding now for several years, product of multiple factors in terms of global monetary policy, quantitative easing and the rest, then it really brings, from a purely pragmatic point of view, the question to play. Where can I invest which will deliver me or my fund higher rates of return in the future? And the answer is, what I see opening around the world is infrastructure writ large, and within that, renewable energy writ somewhat smaller. Some of it will be self-funding of itself, depending on the location of the project and where it is vis-a-vis country risk, and some of it will provide will necessitate the sort of interventions we provided before. I think there's one other thing public can do to help, and that's what I describe as helping the privates, that is the private funds, private investment houses, with the early accumulation of a list of bankable projects by having done some of the fundable research. Then you start to acquire momentum that, oh yeah, we've done that. That was a big project. That was X billion. We got the primary research from ADB and the World Bank. We got some side investment in from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank from the Chinese. We got a bit of OBOR funding over here, One Belt, One Road. I mean, frankly, I don't give a damn where the cash comes from. I'm interested in the global outcome. So there are practical things which public can do.
Great. Got time to take one question from the audience. We've got microphones available. I see a hand. Right over here, Jim.
Jim Walker from the Climate Mobilisation Fund. Thank you for everything you've been doing on climate change. When you were making the call for more sustained public-private partnership on investment, I thought you might have gone the direction of talking about carbon pricing, and I know that you've obviously played a leadership role on that as well. Can you say a little bit more about how you see carbon pricing policy playing a role in incentivizing the scope and scale of investment that we're going to need?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a big believer in carbon pricing for that reason. It's a market-neutral mechanism, doesn't provide a preference for one either regulatory approach or one industry policy approach of I'm all for wind energy and wind energy for the future, or I'm all for regulating against any further construction of coal-fired power stations. If you have a carbon price, which is at a reasonable level, not just at the kick-off point, but actually causes firms to think it's a universal instrument, at least against the bulk of the economy. So I'm a big supporter of it. Secondly, if you look at the Chinese, they've decided after trialling their 7 provincial level emissions trading schemes over the last 3 or 4 years, that they'll move to a national emissions trading scheme in November next year. The Koreans announced one at the end of last year, and the Japanese currently have a limited one between Tokyo and the Saitama prefecture. So the opportunity for regional linkages of the type that we're seeking to develop at a policy level with the Asia Policy Institute, I think exist. You will understand the critique in Europe in terms of its effectiveness. I think that may have something to do with the actual level of the carbon price, but that's a separate debate. You have the example of the various state jurisdictions in the United States cooperating as well. So that's all one response. I think in an ideal world, you would go with a universal carbon price, and certainly within national economies, because it causes all players to think about how best to invest their dollars in construction, energy supply, but also in energy consumption, the decisions that you make as consumers or firms. Okay, let's just say the ideal world's not possible, because you end up with what we ended up with in Australia, which is we legislated, the Conservatives won an election on a fear campaign about climate change and a few other things, and as a result, it gets repealed. The other approach is the hard hand of regulation. I fully understand why President Obama has done that in this country. You have a Congress here which is still not been persuaded that the arguments have reached critical mass, either at a popular level or at a corporate level, as we've seen operate now in other countries. That will come. The congressional outlook on these things, both Senate and House, will change. We can't pinpoint when. So in the interim, not being a student of the American Constitution, let me just say that the President's use of executive orders, I think, is the only option available to him in order to bring about real action. And I applaud him for doing that. It takes political courage in a system such as this. So that's the regulatory route. And they're basically your two sets of alternatives. There's one final thing, though, I'd say, which comes out of the back of my mind from a conversation I had with Nicholas Stern in the United Kingdom, who's done a huge amount of work on this and known to most of you in this room. And I'm a great fan of Nick's work, both analytically and the policy work he's done as well. Nick would say also that there's another thing which governments collectively can do, and that is the pool of available investment capital into primary research in what will be necessary, in his argument, to close that gap between 3 degrees centigrade and 1.5 is another great breakthrough on the technology front, either on energy generation or on energy efficiency. You can see 10 different technologies which are emerging and developing, which get close, but there is, as yet, no, as it were, moonshot being delivered. Does this lie in the domain of what we'd call as large-scale solar storage and all of the subcategories of that debate? Probably. So what can governments do in addition, beyond regulation and beyond, let's call it a market principle of a global and or national or regional carbon price? It's invest at scale in a global renewable energy fund so that the best brains in the world, and you've got a large bunch of them here in America, I've got to say, but they're all over the world, have an incentive delivered by the research dollar to frankly crash through the frontier which needs to be crashed through. I mean, it's a bad analogy, but if you look at what President Roosevelt did with the Manhattan Project, he said, okay, we need to end this war. You go into that room there and you go and develop a nuclear device. And they did. Did they have the blueprint beforehand? No, they didn't. In a way, in terms of political leadership, the moonshot, which is political leaders saying from around the world, we need this technology breakthrough as well. And through a massive concentration of the global research effort, funded by we governments collectively and probably on a proportional basis, providing them with, let's call it historic levels of NASA funding to go and do it. Then, that's I think the third part of the trifecta, which is regulation, carbon pricing where you can deliver it, but also the technology breakthrough, which may not simply come from the market.
The next moonshot needs to be an earth shot. Let me close with one last question about China. You alluded to the fact that China is hard to understand in its totality, even someone who's studied it, known it very well for some time. What is it that we in the West misunderstand about China that we should understand differently?
I think it's this, that when we in the outside world look at China, we often spend most of our time observing China's external or international behavior. We've got a whole bunch of observations to make about that. If we now were sitting in a meeting of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which would be about 220 people, so this group up here, and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is 7 men, by the way. 80% of their priorities, probably 90, are exclusively domestic on how they try and hold this country together. They're transforming the domestic economic model from its historical model of labour-intensive, low-wage manufacturing, high carbon content for export, to a new model, which is less carbon intensity, investment in the services sector, and reliance increasingly on the domestic market rather than simply exports for growth. In the midst of that, you're generating a whole bunch of unemployed people, particularly in the old industrial zones of the northeast of the country, and you've got to adjust for that. And at the same time, you've got the disciplines of their new carbon targets within the country bearing down on their energy sector and traditional manufacturing. So domestically, the reconciliation of the China economic model and its transformation with the employment objective necessary to continue giving 20 million extra Chinese a new job each year, because that's how many people are entering the workforce, and acting in a manner which works in terms of the sustainability of the local environment, quite apart from what you need to do on air pollution and climate change, that takes up a huge slice of the corporate political attention within the country. They don't spend 24 hours a day on the South China Sea. The bulk of each day is how do we hold the show together based on the enormous tensions between economic policy, social stability, and environmental sustainability. In other words, the dilemmas which face us all.
Great note to close on. Please join me in thanking Kevin Rudd for some great insights.
Can I say one thing?
Yep, one more word. One more word.
If any of you are vaguely interested in anything I had to say, then there is a prepared text which I studiously ignored, which will be on your website or ours at the Asia Society. Please have a read. It's a more considered version of what I was going on with. And if you've come from outside of town, how many of you from outside of New York? Oh, right. So when you're flying home, you take my speech, a glass of scotch, and I'll knock you out for the flight.
Great. Thank you very much.